Thank you, everybody, for your attending. Thank you very much to Wendy for our invitation. That is also an occasion for me for meeting again friends from Leuphana, and it is also a great pleasure. And thank you very much for this very, very interesting meeting. Before beginning my lecture today, I want to say that the questions of libraries and archives addressed on Thursday evening are a matter for the question of categorization. And I would like to highlight the fact that the question of categorization that was addressed by Aristotle, and this was the origin of the question of being, that is of ontotheology, is completely upset by the technological development today. After Aristotle, Kant reopened the question of categorization in the transcendental deduction of categories. And then Emile Durkheim criticized this ontological way to question the process of categorization, that existence always is. And doing this, he introduced the question of totemism as a question of categorization. In the 20th century, Emile Benveniste revisited the question of Aristotelian definition of categorization by asking if Aristotle did not discover grammatical categories rather than ontological ones. I sustain myself that these grammatical categories or forms can be distinguished only through what I call the literary tertiary retention that accumulate in libraries and will mutate with printing press, because entering into the everyday life of everybody and not only for the clerks. And I say that these belong to a process of what I call the process of grammatization, that is of discretization and reproduction of flux and flows of the life. And I claim that this begins in the Upper Paleolithic. Saying this, I want to highlight that to think these questions in our age, that is the age of technologies of digital categorization, this being automatic and algorithmic categorization. This computer, for example, I use now, is first of all a machine to categorize, particularly as a networked computer, and categorization is made not only on my computer but on the servers. We must think the process of grammatization for thinking all of these questions of categorization. We must think the process of grammatization that makes categorization in general. And in this evolution of grammatization, there is, of course, the grammatization of gestures by industry engaging thus what Karl Marx will call proletarianization. That will be scientifically optimized by assembly line. Everybody knows that. But I think it is very important to create here a link between logos, techne, and body precisely. I will now talk about what I call general and integrated automation that the digital makes possible, and as the most advanced stage of the process of grammatization. With the advent of the reticular reading and writing that is today the digital, via globally accessible networks that use those web technologies that began to be implemented around 1993, digital technologies have led hyper-industrial societies towards a new stage of proletarianization. In this new stage, the hyper-industrial age is turned into an era of systemic stupidity. Across networks of teleaction. Production centers can be delocalized. Huge markets can be formed and then remotely controlled. Industrial capitalism and financial capitalism can be structurally separated. Electronic financial markets can be continuously interconnected. Directly in real time, the automatisms that are derived from the application of mathematics to the finance industry. Processes of automated decision-making can then be functionally tied to the drive-based automatisms that control consumer markets, initially through the mediation of mass media, and today through the industry of traces that is also known as the data economy, that is the economy of personal data. Digital automata have succeeded in bypassing the deliberative functions of the mind, and a systemic stupidity has been established between consumers and speculators, functionally based in the drives, and pitting each against the other. This goes well beyond what Mats Alvesen and Andre Spicer have called functional stupidity in the Journal of Management of London, in the city. In the last few years, however, and specifically after 2008, a state of general stupefaction seems to have arisen that accompanies this systemic betise, this functional stupidity. The resulting stupor is caused by the most recent series of technological shocks that emerged from the digital turn of 1993. The revelation of these shocks and of their major features and consequences has brought about a state that is almost literally that of being stunned, in particular in the face of the four horsemen of apocalypse: Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. The expression is not mine, it is the one of an American economist, and who appear literally to be disintegrating those industrial societies that emerged from the Aufklärung. The result has been what, in a public meeting of Ars Industrialis in Paris, we have referred to as what we call the net blues, suffered by those who had believed or do believe in the promises of the digital era, including my friends of Ars Industrialis and myself, among many others, and probably many people here. The hyper-industrial societies that have grown out of the ruins of the industrial democracies constitute the third stage of completed proletarianization. In the 19th century, we saw the loss of savoir-faire and the loss of savoir-vivre in the 20th century. And in the 21st century, we are witnessing the dawn of the age of the loss of theoretical knowledge, savoir théorique, academic knowledge, etc., as if the cause of our being stunned was an absolutely unthinkable development. With the total automatization made possible by digital technologies, theories, those most sublime fruits of idealization and identification, are deemed obsolete, and along with them, scientific method itself. So at least we are told by Chris Anderson in 2008. In The End of Theory, the data deluge makes the scientific method obsolete. Founded on the self and auto-production of digital traces, and dominated by automatisms that exploit these traces, hyper-industrial societies are undergoing the proletarianization of theoretical knowledge, just as broadcasting analog traces via television resulted in the proletarianization of savoir-vivre And just as the submission of the body of the laborer to mechanical traces inscribed in machines resulted in the proletarianization of savoir-faire. Just like the written traces in which Socrates already saw the threat of proletarianization, that any exteriorization of knowledge brings with it, the apparent paradox being that the constitution of knowledge depends on the exteriorization of knowledge. So too, digital, analog, and mechanical traces are what I call tertiary retentions, and I will explain later these terms. When Gilles Deleuze referred to what he called control societies, he was already heralding the arrival of the hyper-industrial age. The destructive capture of attention and desire is what occurs in and through those control societies that Deleuze described in terms of the non-coercive modulation exercised by television on consumers at the end of the 20th century. These societies of control appear at the end of the consumerist epoch, and what they do is make a way for the transition to the hyper-industrial epoch. In the automated society of which Deleuze could hardly have been aware, but which he and Félix Guattari anticipated in particular when they referred to what they called individuals and not individuals, control undertakes a mechanical liquidation of discernment from the Greek to krinon, from the verb krinein, a verb that has the same root as crisis, decision. Discernment, which Kant called understanding, Verstand, has been automated and automatized as analytical power that has been delegated to algorithms that convey formalized instructions through sensors and actuators, but outside of any intuition in the Kantian sense, that is, outside of any experience, this being the situation that occupies Chris Anderson. 7 years after the collapse of 2008, it is still not clear how best to characterize this event of 2008. Crisis, mutation, metamorphosis. All these terms are metaphors. They still fall short of actual thinking. Crisis, which has a long history. In Hippocrates, it refers to a decisive turning point in the course of an illness, is also the origin of all critique, of all decision exercised by to krinon as the power to judge on the basis of criteria. Mutation is understood today primarily in relation to biology, even if in French to be muté, muted, generally refers in everyday life to being transferred to another posting in your work. Metamorphosis is a zoological term that comes from the Greek by way of Ovid. 7 years after the event, it seems that the proletarianization of minds, and more precisely, the proletarianization of the noetic faculties of theorization, and in this sense of scientific, moral, aesthetic, and political deliberation, combined with the proletarianization of sensibility and affect in the 20th century with the analog mass media, and with the proletarianization of the gestures of the worker in the 19th century, is both the trigger for and the result of this continuing crisis. As a result, no decisions are taken, nor do we arrive at any turning point, any bifurcation, for speaking with Deleuze's words. Whereas all of the toxic aspects that lie at the origins of this crisis continue to be consolidated. When a triggering factor is also an outcome, we find ourselves in a spiral. This spiral can be very fruitful and worthwhile, or it can enclose us, absent new criteria, in a vicious circle that we describe as a downward spiral, a spirale du pire, we say in French, that takes us from bad to worse. I believe with Francis Jutin in France that the post-Laval state in which we have left the crisis of 2008 means we should refer to it in terms of metamorphosis rather than mutation. What is going on here is not biological, even if biology comes into play via biotechnology and in certain respects in a quasi-proletarianized way. This doesn't mean that there is no crisis or that we need not take account of the critical labor for which it calls. It means that this critical labor is precisely what this metamorphosis seems to render impossible. Thanks precisely to the fact that it consists above all in the proletarianization of theoretical knowledge, which is critical knowledge. It is for this reason that I propose understanding the enduring nature of this crisis on the basis of the metaphor of a chrysalis. The stupefying situation in which the current experience of the automatic society consists establishes a new mental context, stupefaction, within which systemic stupidity undoubtedly proliferates as functional stupidity, described by Spicer and Alvedson like that. It is their description. Drive-based capitalism and industrial populism, but which can also be viewed in relation to a new concern, which, if it is not turned into panic, and now in Europe, panic is coming, and instead becomes a fertile skepsis, could turn out to be the beginning of a new understanding of the situation and the genesis of new criteria, that is, new categories. This is the question of what I call categorical invention. This new understanding of intelligence would be that which, inverting the toxic logic of the pharmacon that technology is, would give rise to a new hyper-industrial age constituting an automatic society founded on deproletarianization, and which would provide an exit from the chrysalis of noetic hymenoptera, and which would provide an exit from chrysalis of noetic hymenoptera that is based on the valorization of positive externalities and capacities in Amartya Sen's sense, that is, on a contributive economy of pollination. The proletarianization of the gestures of work amounts to the proletarianization of the conditions of the worker's subsistence. The proletarianization of sensibility, of sensory life, and the proletarianization of the social relations, all of which are replaced by conditioning, amounts to the proletarianization of the conditions of the citizen's existence. The proletarianization of minds or spirits, that is, of the noetic faculties enabling theorization and deliberation, is the proletarianization of the conditions of the scientific consistency, including the human and social sciences, of course. In the hyper-industrial stage, hyper-control is established through a process of generalized automatization. It thus represents a step beyond the control through modulation discovered and analyzed by Deleuze. Now the noetic faculties of theorization and deliberation are short-circuited by the current operator of proletarianization, that is, digital tertiary retention, or mnemotechnical artifact, that just as analog tertiary retention was in the 20th century the operator of the proletarianization of savoir-vivre, and just as mechanical tertiary retention was in the 19th century the operator of the proletarianization of savoir-faire. By artificially maintaining something through the material and spatial copying of amnesic and temporal elements, tertiary retention modifies the relations between the psychic retentions of perception that Husserl referred to as primary retentions and the psychic retentions of memory that he called secondary retentions. Over time, tertiary retentions evolves, and this leads to modifications of the play between primary retentions and secondary retentions, resulting in processes of trans-individuation. I use here a concept coming from Simondon that are each time specific, that is, specific epochs of what Simondon called the trans-individual. We translate meaning, signification also. In the course of processes of trans-individuation founded on successive epochs of tertiary retention, shared meanings are formed by psychic individuals who thereby constitute collective individuals and what we call societies. The meanings formed during trans-individuation processes and shared by psychic individuals within collective individuals of all kinds constitute the trans-individual in the set of collective secondary retentions, through which collective pretensions are formed, that is, the expectations that typify that epoch or that society. If, according to the Chris Anderson article previously referred to, so-called big data heralds the end of theory, big data technology designating what is also called high-performance computing carried out on massive amounts of data, whereby the treatment of data in the form of digital tertiary retentions occurs in real time, at the speed of light, and on a global scale, and at the level of billions of gigabytes of data, operating through data capture systems that are located everywhere around the planet and in almost every relational system that constitutes a society. It is because digital tertiary retention and the algorithms that allow it to be both produced and exploited thereby also make it possible for reason as a synthetic faculty to be short-circuited, thanks to the extremely high speed at which this automated analytic faculty of understanding is capable of operating. And I repeat here that for Kant, understanding and reason are two different faculties, but understanding without reason is extremely problematic. We are in a situation today in which we have an automatic understanding functioning and making the main business of economy without reason. In automatic society, those digital networks that are referred to as social networks channel such expressions by submitting them to monetary protocols to which psychic individuals bend because they are drawn to do so by the so-called network effect, which with the addition of social networking becomes an automated herd effect. That is a highly mimetic situation, and one that constitutes a new form of artificial group in the sense given to this phrase by Freud after reading Gustave Le Bon. 10 years ago, I compared TV or radio programs and channels to the constitution of artificial and conventional crowds, such as they are analyzed by Freud, for which he gives the example of army and church. The constitution of crowds and the conditions under which they can take shape are the subject of analysis by Gustave Le Bon, commented by Freud in this book, on which Freud, yes, commented at length, and I quote here Gustave Le Bon. The most striking peculiarity presented by a psychological crowd is the following. Whoever be the individual that composes it, however like or unlike be their mode of life, their occupations, their character, or their intelligence. The fact that they have been transformed into a crowd puts them in possession of a sort of collective mind which makes them feel, think, and act in a manner quite different from that in which each individual of them would feel, think, and act were he or her in a state of isolation. There are certain ideas and feelings which do not come into being or do not transform themselves into acts except in the case of individuals forming a crowd. The psychological group is a provisional being formed of heterogeneous elements which for a moment are combined exactly as the cells which constitute a living body form by their reunion a new being which displays characteristics very different from those possessed by each of the cells singly, unquote. On the basis of the analysis by Gustave Le Bon, Freud showed that there are also artificial crowds then, which he now analyzes with this example of church and army, but now we have also channels of media, mass media, etc., who replaced church, for example. The program industries, too, however, also form then every single day, and specifically through the mass broadcast of programs such artificial groups, and the later become as masses, the permanent everyday mode of being of the industrial democracies, which are at the same time what I call industrial telecracies. Generated by digital tertiary tension, net-connected artificial groups constitute an economy of crowdsourcing that must be understood in manifold ways, and which the so-called cognitaria would be one dimension. Big data is one very large component of those technologies that exploit the potential of crowdsourcing in its various forms, of which social engineering is a major element. Through the network effect, through artificial groups that the network effect allows to be created, such as the billions of psychic individuals who are now on Facebook, and through crowdsourcing that allows these groups to be exploited, including through the use of big data, it is possible, first, to stimulate the production and auto-capture by individuals of those tertiary tensions we call personal data, which spatialize their psychosocial temporalities. Second, to intervene by circulating this personal data at the speed of light in the processes of transindividuation that are woven through circuits, which are formed automatically and performatively. And third, through these circuits and through the collective secondary tension that form automatically and no longer transindividually, to intervene in return almost immediately in psychic secondary tensions, which is also to say in protensions, expectations, and ultimately in personal behavior. It becomes possible to remotely control, to teleguide one by one each of the members of a network. This is what is referred to as personalization in marketing. The internet is a pharmacon that can thus become a technique for hyper-control and social disintegration. Unless there is a new politics of individuation, that is, unless attention is formed through a specific tertiary tension that make possible a new technical milieu and every associated milieu beginning with language, it will inevitably become a cause of dissociation, that is, of destruction of societies. The pharmacological character of the digital age has become more or less clear to those who belong to it, resulting in what I am calling net blues. The state of fact constituted by this new age of tertiary tension has failed to provide a new state of law. On the contrary, it has liquidated the rule of law, as produced by the retentional system of the bygone epoch. Property law, for example, has been directly challenged by activists through their practices in relation to free software. and through reflecting on the commons, including some young artists who are attempting to devise a new economic and political framework for their thinking. These questions must, however, be seen as part of an epistemic and epistemological transition from fact to law, and by canonical reference to apodictic experience, projecting law beyond fact. A science is always, a knowledge is always a projection of law beyond facts. The passage from fact to law is firstly a matter of discovering in facts the necessity of interpreting them, that is, of projecting beyond the facts themselves, but also on the basis of the facts that are not themselves self-sufficient onto another plan towards which they beckon, that of a consistency, the plan of consistency. It was also the expression by Deleuze, through which and in which we must believe, as Deleuze said in Le Temps, l'image temps, excuse me. This other plane is the one of negantropy. If we are now living in the Anthropocene, this state of fact is not sustainable, as we know. We must pass to a state of law in which negantropy becomes the criteria of all types of value, the value of values, and this is why we must enter into what I call the neganthropocene. The context of this task of thinking conceived as therapeutic is one in which automatisms of all kinds are being technologically integrated by digital automatisms. The unique and very specific aspect of this situation is the way that digital tertiary attention succeeds in totally rearranging assemblages or montages of psychic and collective retentions and pretensions. The challenge is to invert this situation by having an arc of hyper-control, instead reach towards a new idea of disautomatization that would arise from out of today's disintegrating automatization. Thank you for your attention.